across the Atlantic with nothing but names. Irish and Scottish blood in our veins. Work the mines and the boats in the land. Built this life with calloused hands. That's how we got here.
So I want to welcome everybody back today on my on this episode of the podcast. I have Darren Hall, who has an interesting paper that he submitted to the United Empire Loyalist Association, but the genealogy of one of his ancestors. And I came across Darren through a mutual contact through a museum and historical society here on PI I'm a member of. So I'm going to let Darren tell a little bit about his story. But first, before we really begin, something I like to ask everybody, Darren, is how did you get an interest in genealogy?
Well, it's actually funny you ask. I happen to have the very book that got me into this in the first place right here. So there was a couple of things. So first of all, my mother's from PEI. And as a kid, I live in Ontario, but every summer we were there, almost every summer. And she was raised by her grandparents. So my great-grandparents, family name is Waugh, based in North Bedeque. And, I treasure those memories as a kid. And of course, since she was raised by her grandparents, I got to know that older generation. So my great aunts and uncles and my great aunts and uncles who were all still living in the 70s. So I knew some of these names, and of course I knew my great grandparents really well. They lived on until I was about 20 when I lost them, which I consider myself very fortunate for. Anyway, this book here was actually belonged to my great grandmother. It's called The Wrights of Bedeque. So that's the Wright family. That was a Loyalist family, and my mother's grandmother was a Wright. So her name was Bertie Wright, Bertie. And what actually got me into it was this book here, A Bridge to the Past. So I don't know if this was going on in other provinces at the time, but around late 70s, maybe around 1980, there was a centennial event going on, and all the local historical societies were getting together and putting genealogies together. So just local histories. This one was A Bridge to the Past. This was Wilmot Valley. So for those who don't know, that's North Bedeque, Summerside, that area of Prince Edward Island. And there weren't too many people there. In fact, there was no one there that wasn't Indigenous, before the Loyalists arrived in 1784. So I come from some of those Loyalist families, and it kind of spurred an interest in the subject. So with these two books here, I started in the mid-1990s, I guess, and started building on it, found out who our Loyalist ancestor was, James Waugh. And I've been it's kind of like, I'm sure if you're watching this podcast, you probably have the same enjoyment that you get out of genealogy that I do. It's like solving a mystery. So this is Dusty. But yeah, it's almost like an addiction, it's like I just have this burning need to know more about who I am and where I came from, and this is it. So over the past few years, I've been kind of moving more and more as I get a little bit older to wanting to write more about them. So for the past 20 years, I've been using tools like Ancestry, and before that, software programs like Family Tree Maker. And, they're great at recording life events, birth, marriage, death. Sometimes you'll get census information and other kinds of things like that. But when I went to university, I took history. So I also have the interest in Canadian history. And I've always kind of felt the best way to learn about our own ancestors is to not only know the names and dates, but also to learn a little bit about what was going on around them during their lifetime and what kind of events affected their lives. With a loyalist, it's obvious, the American Revolution was a pivotal moment in their lives. That was a period of time, but then there's also an almost equally important period of time after that, and to me, I look at it as, what is the story that brought them to Canada? And I want to start finding more about what that looks like. And for me, my ancestors are European. So, as a Canadian, that's dating back a couple of hundred years now. And it's especially for people that were just farmers. A lot of us are descended from farmers, and they're not as literate, and there's less written about these people. So combining the history of where and when they lived, combined with what primary sources we can find in things like censuses and so forth, I'm trying to bring these things together and tell a little bit more about their lives than just, the basics, like when were they born and where were they born and when did they die and things like that.
So, and that is one of the things that, I think is really important in genealogy too. It's getting to know those stories behind the facts, I guess. It's sort of
Absolutely.
And it does give you a better understanding of their life by understanding the history around it. As a history student myself, I remember that, learning some of those things. I was in a class at university on Canadian 20th century history with in the late 80s, and there was two gentlemen who were seniors that were at the time that the university, you could take courses free if you were a senior, and they were there and they actually lived this period. And I was probably, as a 19, 20-year-old, I was probably the only person in the class who was really interested in working with these guys when we did group projects, because they had firsthand knowledge, and the history I learned from them was much more than anything I learned in books.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the same as when I started researching my own family history, which was about the same time. Aside from the facts, when I just started learning more and then trying to put in perspective pieces of my family's that I know about into the history of the time. So when you started digging, what did you find out?
Well, for years, I was really just relying on the primary source documents that are available. And of course, there isn't much. So, I'm not the first person to try to learn more about the Waugh family that came to Prince Edward Island. And there are others who've written books like the Wrights of Bedeque. That's a big 2-volume set. There's a similar story that was written about the Skiermans from the same area, and William Skierman was the person who brought a group of loyalists over to that entire area and settled on some of William Patterson's land, for which he granted gave some grants out to in 1784. So these were my primary and secondary sources that I relied upon. I was able to find information about the grant document itself about 20 years ago, and the most I knew about James Waugh was in that document and a subsequent map of the Wilmot Valley, which showed where the grants were, essentially. So my ancestors' grant was right at what we call Reed's Corner now. I think there's been a gas station there for many, many years. And I believe at one time there was a grist mill run by the Waugh family right around there. So we knew about that. We knew that my cousins are still farming that land, some of them. And when I finally got a hold of the actual document from Governor Patterson to grant the land to my ancestor, James Waugh, it I was really trying to find out, well, where was he from? If he was a loyalist, that implies he was an American in the American colonies prior to 1783. So where was he? So in the land grant document, all it says that he is late of New York of the province of New York. So I took that to mean New York City, not just the colony of New York, but the city of New York itself. And the more I thought about it, at first I thought, okay, now I need to scour all the records I can from New York to see what I can find. I spent years at that, and I really didn't get very far. Um, Eventually, I came to understand a little bit more about the American Revolution in general. And of course, for those who know, New York was the kind of the last bastion of a loyalist stronghold in what became the United States. And before they all withdrew to Shelburne and Halifax and St. John and places like that after the War of the Revolution, um, it isn't that much of a stretch to say that he came from New York. He could have come from anywhere before that. So I was kind of at a standstill, and I had nothing to go on. Um, I believe he was a Quaker, at least for some of his life. And the reason why I believe that is because we know that he married Rachel Townsend, whose father's brother was a renowned Quaker minister. So in the paper that I've written, his name was John Townsend, and his brother James settled at Park Corner in PEI, which is on the North Shore near Cavendish. So the Townsends were fairly well known, and in fact, they're loosely linked with Lucy Maud Montgomery. So there's a little bit of a neat connection there, the Lake of Shining Waters and all that. So I had a little bit of that anecdotal evidence. He married into the Townsends, who were Quakers, and then his son and eventual heir Alexander Waugh married a Irish Quaker family, the Hall family. So not the same Hall that I am today. That's obviously my father's side, but there were Halls that came from the middle of Ireland that were Quakers in the early 1800s, and they settled in that same area and they intermarried. So because of that intermarriage, I thought, okay, I need to find a Quaker. So it kind of went from that point on, and a few years later, they digitized a collection called the Carlton Papers. So that's Sir Guy Carlton, who he was basically into, a lot of you folks might know this, but he was put in charge of, basically the retreat from New York. And then afterwards became one of our governors general of Canada. So, but before that, he was basically the person who people were petitioning to say, I'm a loyalist, I deserve a grant of land, and here's why. So I spent a lot of time looking for a loyalist petition, and I never did find one. In fact, I'd never found a loyalist petition for any of the people in that group. There was a number of settlers that all traveled together from Shelburne in 1784 in the summer, which they had been there for at least 6 months in Shelburne. So these folks moved on to Prince Edward Island, no doubt learning that the farming land was much better. So these people were, for the most part, farmers. And so when they moved over, I started looking around a little bit more. And as I said, the Carlton Papers became digitized and became a searchable database. So I said, oh, well, I probably won't find anything, but I'll search for the name Waugh and see what comes up. Well, the name James Waugh did come up in one place, and it was a light horse muster roll dated December 1778 in Pensacola, Florida, of all places. So I thought, okay, I don't know if this could possibly be my ancestor. It's the same name. And by this point, when I had gotten through my research, I spent years looking on the internet, and there are Waughs. There were Waughs in obviously Scotland, but in the United States, there were a few pockets of settlements of Waughs in the 1700s in particular. And most of them were centered around either Virginia or Pennsylvania. And of course, if you know a little bit about Pennsylvania, you know that the two major influxes of immigrants from the British Isles there, or from Europe in general, were either German or Quakers. So it became a Quaker hotbed, and of course Presbyterians and Scotch Irish started coming over, and of course they were kind of mixed and mingled with each other by the mid 1700s. So that's where I started suspecting there might be some sort of a connection. So that's kind of how I got up to that point.
And was the other Loyalist settlers, are you finding any connections to them that would indicate that there was these groups of people knew each other, not just in New York, but prior to that, was there any evidence of other ones coming from that Pensacola area?
I'm not sure yet. I know a bit about the Skiermans and Wrights because other researchers have put a lot of time into that. Ross Graves and Doris Munsey Haslam are names that people in PEI genealogy tend to know about because of their work with the Skiermans. So William Skierman was from New Rochelle, which is just across the strait from Manhattan, and Westchester, New York. So some of the folks that came in that same group with William Skierman were also from that area: White Plains, New York, Westchester, even Long Island, and what is now Queens. The Wrights were from the Westchester area, so they could have been neighbors. They could have known each other in some cases. Not all from that group that ended up in the Bedeque area were from Westchester, but a few of them were. So my understanding of what was happening at the time was Governor Patterson of PEI was trying to get more people to come to Prince Edward Island to try and, build the province up and make use of some of the vacant land that was going on. And of course, that whole quit rent controversy that lasted for many, many years afterwards came partly out of that. But at the time, he was trying to attract people to PEI to settle. So word got around in Shelburne, and in Shelburne at the time in 1783, there were tens of thousands of refugees that they knew that these people were coming, but trying to build log houses in a town that really didn't exist a few years before, and the little town lots that they had, plus the fact that that part of Nova Scotia is very rocky. It's not great for farming. So if you're a fisherman, that's okay, but if you're a farmer, that's not a good place to be. So many of the Loyalists that ended up in Shelburne were unhappy with the situation. Everybody was scrambling to get their little scraps of what they could. So this was an opportunity for, on the one hand, they're a little bit out in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, but on the other hand, there was great opportunity from a farming perspective and also from a timber perspective, because it was just wild land, really, for the most part. So some of them, like the Murrays and the Greens, were from the northeastern U.S., but not necessarily Westchester and that part of New York. I've looked at the background of a number of them, and I'd love to write about a number of them, like Laforgie and Matart and some of those other names that came over between the end of the 7 Years' War and the end of the American Revolution. So they weren't all together, and they didn't all necessarily know each other prior to arriving in Shelburne, although a few of them may have. Another name that is notable from the area is Jesse Strang. So he was can't remember if he was nephew or son of Daniel Strang, who was, I guess, what they would call a Tory. And I think he was hung for treason by the Patriots. But he was an important figure in New York for a short period of time there as well. So anyway, it's all been fascinating to me, and these stories are some of the stories of the people that came to Prince Edward Island from Shelburne intermingle with each other, but not all.
And so you've traced this James Waugh down to being part of a military unit from Pensacola area in Florida.
Yeah. Also,
So-
I have to distinguish one quick thing about that. So he appears on a muster roll with 6 individuals. It didn't look like a regular company. He didn't have a rank. There was no rank. All of the other people on the muster roll had ranks, ensign this, captain that. And he was with 2 captains in particular that both had very important roles to play in the area at the time, especially with respect to Indian affairs. But yeah, it was notable to me that he didn't hold a rank. As a Quaker and a Loyalist, he probably wouldn't have held a military rank. So it was interesting that he even appeared on a muster roll at all. And with the research that I had done on the Waugh families, there were more than one James Waugh living at the time in the United States, and there is documented evidence of them. But one of the reasons why I was at a brick wall for so many years was the fact that every one of the Waughs that I had found, other than the one I'm researching, were patriots, and they stayed in the United States. And the only one that I knew that came up to Shelburne was the one that I'm related to. So anyway.
And patriots are kind of a loose term. I mean, really, weren't they traitorous colonists? Weren't they the really
Rebels? Rebel scum.
The traitors. As I like to remind my American friends every July 4th when they're celebrating that traitorous rebellion. So he was a Quaker. Yes, like as you mentioned, they generally did not serve in the military because of their their beliefs, but they're
very much pacifists.
Yeah, but they are known to be involved. So did you make anything or find anything about why he was in this muster roll?
I'm still in the process of piecing all of it together, but here's what my theory is, and here's what I've written into this manuscript I've put together. So the next step for me was to do some YDNA testing. So I convinced a cousin, David Waugh, and my uncle, Randy. Both of them did a big Y test. They're big and expensive, and they take a long time, but they can sometimes provide some really good information. I was lucky enough to find big Y matches. You don't always get that. And I don't know if you've gotten into YDNA research at all, but for example, my dad doesn't know who his father is. That's another reason why I've gotten into genealogy, is to find out who his father was. And I think I found it, but the YDNA test only came up with a match, and it matches to before the time of surnames. So that's not helpful for genealogy at all. It can give you a kind of a general area. But with the Waughs, I was lucky. I ended up being matched with 6 other testers, 4 of whom had the surname Wilson, and the 2 that don't have the surname Wilson roll up to the surname Wilson. So it became quite evident very quickly that if I go father's father back in time into the 1600s, tracing from my Waugh line, they're not Waughs, they're Wilsons, which I must say has come as a bit of a shock to some of my cousins. And I feel bad, but at the same time, we should be proud of who we are, and who we are doesn't change. You go back to the 1600s, and maybe a child was adopted because his parents were killed. That happened a lot in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. Um, Anything could have happened. It could have been an illegitimate child as well, either in Scotland or somewhere in the United States. But the thing that's interesting about the muster roll entry was it was in Pensacola. So I took a look at on that muster roll, who are the commanding officers? There were two captains listed, which was also a little bit unusual. In a muster roll, often you just have one captain and his company. Alexander Cameron was one of the names, and the other name was Richard Parris, spelled Pearis. So I looked at Parris first. It turns out he flip-flopped a little bit between the two sides in the years leading up to the revolution. But one thing led to another, and he sided with the British. And what happened was he was living in South Carolina, near the 96th district, and that became a pretty big hotbed of chaos, really. But eventually, the Patriots got together enough of a force that ended up capturing him. They imprisoned him for a while, put his family through hell, and then he was allowed to let go. But the great thing about this is when you find a captain, you can usually find out what they did. So I can't find out what James Waugh did because he wasn't even a commissioned officer of any kind. So there's nothing written about him. But because he appeared on a muster roll with a short list of people, I can vicariously surmise what could have happened had he been traveling with the person who he was working with at, very shortly thereafter. So where I'm going with this is Richard Parris he had to kind of flee because the Patriots has kind of overrun his property and they were looking for him. Same with Alexander Cameron. I'll get to Cameron in a moment, but for Richard Parris, he ended up getting help from the Cherokee and the Creek Indians to travel through the backwoods down from 96 in South Carolina down to Pensacola, which is almost straight south through the wilderness. So after a couple of weeks of doing that, they arrived in Pensacola, which was a British outpost at the time. And at the time, there were two colonies, East and West Florida. And the British Army had a post at Pensacola, and they were trying to rally back there. So a lot of the backcountry South Carolina Loyalists ended up converging in that area. Richard Parris ended up acting as an Indian agent to try and secure partnerships with the Creek Indians down towards Mobile, Alabama. And I thought, okay, well, if James Waugh was with him for at least some of that, he would have been involved in some of those negotiations. So basically, he had ammunition and rum and was trading that to secure the loyalty of the Indians down there. At the same time, the other captain that appeared on that same muster roll in Pensacola, Alexander Cameron, it turns out after I've researched some land records in South Carolina, I found a James Waugh who obtained a land grant right in that area where the Loyalists in the South Carolina, that backcountry area were. And he was literally a stone's throw away from Alexander Cameron. So Cameron was doing the same thing with the Cherokee. And I'm actually reading a fascinating book now by an author named Nadia Dean, and she's written a book called A Demand of Blood. And it's all about the manhunt for Alexander Cameron. The reason why they was he was on the British side of the War of Independence, and he was trying to secure the loyalty of the Cherokee, because there were several reasons for it, of course, one of which was the Patriots were terrified of they've heard atrocities about, Indians capturing and scalping and raping and torture and all kinds of things like that. Some of it was true and some of it was, just kind of sensationalized. sort of like the propaganda that we're seeing all over the internet today. There's propaganda was so powerful even back then, and that drove a lot of public opinion. So the Patriots hated him and they were hunting him. So it's interesting that James Waugh was on this muster roll with these two individuals. I looked at it from the Richard Parris point of view, and I followed his movement after that muster roll. So after the negotiation with the Indians was taking place, he ended up joining up with forces in East Florida, and there's no record of James Waugh after that with any of that. So what happened in Pensacola within a few months of that was the Spanish ended up declaring war on the British, and they ended up overrunning Pensacola. And people that would have been in Pensacola would have been prisoners taken to Havana, Cuba. Eventually, the British prisoners, the King of Spain, allowed them to leave, provided they went straight to New York and didn't involve themselves in this with the Spanish in the war or take any aggressive action towards Spain. So that is how I put one and one together of how did James Waugh get to New York City? If it's the same individual, and I'm still working, on this detail, but the more and more I hear back from anecdotal evidence, learning more about the people that were on that muster roll, but also in combination with who are my YDNA matches and where were their ancestors from, this story started coming together. So I took all of those sources together and what was going on at the time, and that's what I put together in this article. So the YDNA matches were, most of them were Wilsons living right by where the Waughs in Pennsylvania were, like literally within it's modern Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But in the 1750s to 1780s, the Wilsons and Waughs were living right beside each other, right there in Pennsylvania. And my YDNA relatives trace back to those Pennsylvania Wilsons. So that's where we put that whole big story together.
And that would make sense, as especially him if he was a loyalist in South Carolina, going as a Quaker, accompanying and a neighbor of Cameron, accompanying him as I guess as they fled, because regardless of him being a pacifist or not, if he was a loyalist, they would be out to I guess take his land and possibly his life. So it would make sense that he would flee with a compatriot in that sense, and somebody who I guess would possibly be looking after him, though. And then coming to Pennsylvania. So was the Pennsylvania Waughs, were they prior to this, that were the connection, were they in Pennsylvania already while he was in? Okay.
Yeah, so where I put that together was the area where the Waughs and Wilsons were in Pennsylvania. It was a similar situation in South Carolina. Some of the early colonists were English. Mm-hmm. But in the early 1700s, a lot of the Ulster plantation Scotch Irish started moving over, and there are Waughs and Wilsons from the same part of Scotland, which in our case is Roxburghshire, right near the border with England. And I've got ties that go back to Hawick in Roxburghshire. But that being said, those same Waughs and Wilsons were in Ulster in Scotland. So Londonderry and that kind of area, Antrim, some of those counties. But by the 1720s, they started migrating to Pennsylvania. In particular, some of the Scotch Irish ended up going down to the Carolinas. Ours went to Pennsylvania, and we're in that backcountry. So there was Philadelphia, and of course, Philly was a big Quaker hotbed. But the cheaper land was out in counties like Cumberland and Lancaster. But by the time you got to the 1760s and early 1770s, all that land had been gobbled up by white Europeans, and it was becoming much more expensive. If you weren't the heir of your farm, where were you going to develop your own farm? You needed to find some other land. So by that time, it had just been after the Cherokee War, which was part of the French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s. They had secured a big purchase of land in what is now the backcountry of South Carolina, parts of Virginia, and then of course North Carolina. So there was a great migration of Scotch Irish from Pennsylvania down through the Shenandoah Valley and into the Carolinas. Some of them went on to places like St. Louis and Ohio, and some of them turned south and went down to Carolina. And I was able to find land plat records. If you go to the website for the state of South Carolina, they actually have those online. You can see the actual descriptions of the original land grants. They're called land plat documents. And I was able to find a group of Waughs. It ended up being that there were two groups of Waughs and then a couple of Wilson families that all came and arrived sometime in the late 1760s to early 1770s into South Carolina. And the name James Waugh, as I mentioned, appeared very close to Alexander Cameron, a couple of the other Wilsons that were in that area, and some of the other Loyalists. And then there was a family of other Waughs, John Waugh and a couple of others, that were a little bit further inland, and they were in a nearby but not close. Like it would, maybe be a day or two walk to get to where they were from where you were. So that being said, when I saw all of that land information, it really helped help me understand that it makes logical sense to see that the YDNA connections to Pennsylvania may have migrated down into the Carolinas right around that time. So that's kind of where I put it all together. It's hard to find a primary source document and say, that's my guy, especially when you're looking at a name like Wilson. Imagine trying to find a single John Wilson in the 1780s. There's hundreds of them. So that's really hard. The only way that I've been able to successfully do it by looking at my other YDNA matches is by looking at wills and deed records. This person their land was willed to them by their father was from this place, and that's how you make the connection. In the Waugh, in the case of the Waughs, it was a little bit easier, although my biggest challenge, of course, is the same as a lot of genealogists, in that he may not have been the only James Waugh. He may not have even been the only James Waugh in South Carolina. But when you have enough coincidences, that it puts together a plausible theory. And that's what I'm working with.
And that's what, we have to do as genealogists a lot of times. It's, since we don't have anybody that is actual witnesses, or we, there's not something that, you can physically track down. Now we do have DNA, which helps with that a little, but where you make that DNA connection, it could be way past, and that Wilson could, like you said, been from a connection back in Scotland, back in Ulster, at any point. So you don't know.
Yeah, and the only thing that really kind of pokes a little bit of a hole in it is I can't 100% tell yet whether the Wilson-Waugh connection was actually made in Scotland or Ireland or Pennsylvania. It could have been any of the three,
Yeah.
because I don't know yet. So what I'm doing to help try and bridge that gap is, I'm fortunate in that as I mentioned, these other YDNA matches that I have, the Wilsons, several of them have really well built family trees backed by primary source records and many years of educated research. So they know what they're talking about. And I've taken a look at their evidence very closely, and I can corroborate that they're probably right with their research. And as such, they're all at different levels of brick walls. One of them traces to Danville, Pennsylvania, which was actually in Cherokee territory in the late 1700s. So the person who he's looking for is a William Wilson from that area. So I'm trying to help him find where he came from. The records say he was from Danville, PA, but Danville, PA didn't exist when he was born. So he must have come from somewhere else in Pennsylvania or maybe even Ireland directly. I believe he was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which was a natural migration path, basically working its way along the Susquehanna River, further and further inland where the cheaper land was later on. And as I said, the deed records and will probate records that exist, which, by the way, if you're ever doing research on, ancestors from Pennsylvania in particular, Family Search has the digitized records, and you don't need to be in one of their family research centers to access a lot of them. Some of them you do, but most of the time the public records, like the land registry deed indexes and the actual deeds and probate records themselves, you can access from your home PC, and that's what I've been doing. It's tedious. You need to be able to read scribbly cursive from the 1700s, but I'm getting pretty good at it, and it's fun for me. So I've been doing a lot of that.
So you're getting us all the information, and it's like we talked about it earlier, and you mentioned it's really important to get this sense of where you came from, how your family arrived where they are, how you got here, and how you when you're doing that, and you've done a great job at combining DNA evidence with the records. I know often people rely on too much on one side or the other. They ignore.
Yeah.
They ignore the other evidence that's possible.
Yeah, including things like history and even religion. Church, not just church records, but what was important. Who were the big preachers? What were they talking about? And how that can have a major impact. We think about it now, a lot of people aren't so religious as they were a couple of hundred years ago. But back in the days of James Waugh in the late 1700s, early 1800s, a lot of these people lived and breathed religion, especially Quakers.
Yeah.
So it very, very much shaped what their lives were like.
And especially communities, that was the community was often founded around the church, people, and that was where you gathered to hear news. That's where you gathered not just to worship. It was more than that. That's where marriages were arranged, or not necessarily arranged in their sense we think now, but that's where you meet your future spouses and the families and the people you had contact with is in your community. They're the ones that if there was something, if your husband died, that would help look after you and your children, and they were much more important. And definitely understanding the different religions, even some of their beliefs, and sometimes you can get very unique things that you get down to specific regions where it does make an important difference in knowing that. Like
Yep.
the fact that him being a Quaker, that explains why he would not have a military rank. You know, if a person didn't understand that and understand what being a Quaker involved, they might try to read something else into that. Or
Oh yeah, and you can extrapolate forward a little bit too and find connections. Like they didn't remain Quakers. The Waugh family, by the time you got to the mid 1800s, Quakerism was kind of fizzling out on the island, partly because there was no established meeting. They tried to establish one at around the New London area, which at that time was called Elizabethtown, but it didn't work. There's a great book that was written about it that I've read. I can't remember the author, but it was recent. Really, really good book. Anyway, yeah, it's by the time you get to the mid 1800s, Methodism was on the rise, and Baptists, and of course my great grandfather Brewer Waugh was a very religious man, and you can like I remember as a kid, and from things that my mom has told me, because she was raised by her grandparents, just about how they lived their lives and the kinds of things that they wore, their belief system. My grandfather was never too far from his family Bible. That's how they lived. And there's Quaker elements to that, so it's almost like he's got those years of tradition brought forward. One of the things that carried forward to me today is whenever I go home to see my mother, she makes me homemade porridge just the way that her grandfather used to have. And every day that she knows of his life, he would get up and have a bowl of porridge and brown sugar, and he lived to the ripe old age of 93, which was pretty good in the early later 20th century. So lots of family tradition carries forward, and you can see evidence of it even in the generations that you do have connections with. So I see a lot of value in that too.
definitely. And where do you see this research going? What's your end goal? I know with genealogy, we don't often have a specific end goal because we want to go back as far as possible and research, but sometimes we have specific ones. What do you want to do to be able to share this information with family members, people that are just interested in the community history, even of where they are there, and even I can see, if it's developed right, people that are just trying to understand what the Loyalist experience would have been. Maybe are you trying to find out, is one of your end goals maybe to find out why he was a Loyalist? Or was there any connection or purpose behind that? And then as far as distributing this information, how do you see you're doing this?
Well, thank you for asking. My hope is to build reconstruct the stories of some of these individuals. And where I draw the passion from with this is everybody wants to be proud of who they are. And part of why we get into genealogy in the first place is to learn about who we are and be proud of it. And I think, Americans are different from Canadians fundamentally in a lot of ways. But one thing that I don't think we as Canadians have done nearly well enough is we should be more proud of who we are and where we came from. Whether you're Indigenous, if you were from here before, you should be proud of that. Celebrate your culture, share your culture. My ancestors mostly were European, and therefore, as a European, I want to be proud of who I am. I want to be proud. I want to know what it's like to be a Scot or an English person. Bring those traditions and share that information. And where I want to go with it is I'm going to write a full biography of James Waugh. I want to get a few more facts, a little bit more concrete before I do it. This manuscript is more, mostly hypotheses. And I could be wrong on some of this stuff. Like I just found out last night, for example, a new terminal haplogroup with our YDNA was created just for the two Waugh testers, my uncle and my cousin. And because of that, there's a small chance that my ancestor wasn't even born in the United States. He may have been born in Scotland and came straight over to New York. And I need to get to the bottom of that. So when I feel a little bit more confident about that, I'm going to put together a biography about his life. But the way I want to look at it is, it's one thing to understand what he did during the American Revolution. But what fascinates me is, imagine it's 1784 and you arrive on your property, which is just flat out woods, as thick as you can see. And the only way of getting around anywhere is a small creek that goes out to the ocean, and you can follow the shoreline to Charlottetown from Summerside. That was it. If you didn't have a boat, you were pretty much stuck where you were, and all you had was some couple of barrels of salt pork, some nails, some saws, a few tools, maybe if you're lucky, some shingles, and have at it. And to me, that's heroic. It's one thing to say, oh, he was a hero in the war. That's great. But I think the true heroes and what makes our country heroic is not just people from 200 years ago, but even people that are coming to our country right now from other places in the world, like India or Africa or wherever, any part of the world. When you're coming to, what makes us Canadians is the fact that, in the United States is a big melting pot, and that's one way of looking at it. But we respect other cultures a little bit, I feel like a little bit more here and more distinctly here. And we celebrate multiculturalism. But I want to be able to identify who are our heroes, who are our Paul Bunyans, and who are our Daniel Boones, people like Pocahontas, who were the big heroes of our past, and we just don't have those stories. So I feel like there is so much room for us to learn about the people that came and helped build our country, whether it was 30 years ago or 300 years ago, and learn more about their personal stories, the sacrifices, the hardships that they went through, and how they survived to make a life for themselves here in Canada. So
Yeah,
that's what I want to do.
And definitely with the Loyalists, I've always thought I have a definite heart feeling for them and compassion, just because I see their family, most of them would have came a generation 2 or 3 before them, probably took a good generation or 2 to get established in the new world, and just starting to feel comfortable. And then because of essentially political opinion, they found themselves now having to go through this all again. Now going from having a comfortable farm that they where, and land that they knew, in a community they knew, being forced to start over yet again.
That's absolutely right. A lot of people in the American Revolution, I don't think everybody quite realizes, without really getting into the depth here, that a lot of the people that came over as Loyalists weren't people that were used to the rugged life of outdoors as pioneers. Their ancestors had been in the American colonies for 100 years.
Yeah.
In some cases, a lot of the Europeans that came over in the mid to late 1600s, their descendants 100 to 130 years later were the ones that ended up having to start all over again in the wilderness. These are people who could have been bankers, lawyers, those are some of the highfalutin type jobs and that kind of thing. They weren't all big wig people like that, but there were people like cobblers and tinsmiths and blacksmiths and things like that. And if here's an axe and some nails, that woods over there is yours, go build a fence and a log cabin. That's incredible to me, to take that and make something with it.
and yeah, and I even think like even the farmers that would have come from established, they were used to dealing in farmland that was had been cleared by their
Yeah.
ancestors, and had those fences and stuff already put up. Um, yeah,
Yeah, James Waugh didn't spend most of the rest of his life as a farmer. He spent a lot of the last years of his life cutting down trees
yeah.
and selling timber, because that's really all he had when he got there. So, there's that too.
So, so you're hoping to put this together as a book, which is awesome. I think that not enough people do that with their family history. They put all this work into it, and they just keep it to themselves, so to speak. Where others, not necessarily just in your family, can have so much to learn about the times and the people that will help inform them. Now, I like to ask, as a genealogist and somebody doing family history research, what would you, if you could do one thing to make your life easier as a genealogist, if you had one superpower, so to speak, what would it be? What would that thing that you would want to be able to do?
Well, wouldn't it be cool if we had a time machine?
Yeah,
It would be tricky though, imagine. I could only imagine you'd really have to be in the right frame of mind to go back and talk to your own relatives and not sound like someone that should be burnt at the stake, but because our lives are so different from how
yeah,
those people lived. But yeah, that's really it. It's just what we've got. If I could go back in time and just say, write some things down, please. Just what's your favorite color? What's your favorite music? All those things are lost forever, and there's
yeah,
nothing we can do to get them back except we can say, well, this was popular among people that went to this church at this time, but I can't tell whether James Waugh liked that music or not, for
yeah,
example. Or, you know, a lot of Scottish people made scones and oatmeal. And did my ancestors do that? I don't know. All I know is what people like them did. So that's all I can tell today. I wish I could tell, that the first page of my manuscript is a picture, which I used AI to create. So I took a photograph of my mother's father, his father, his father, and his brother. So four different generations of Waz. And I gave the AI engine all of these images, and I said, make an image of a person with these likenesses. See if you can draw some similarities, and assume that it's 1820 and the person is a Quaker. So it came up with a picture, and I was actually kind of blown away. And I've shared this with a few of my Waugh cousins, and they've said, "Wow, I can actually see why in the picture of this person." So that's cool. But where I was going with that is, you know, I don't know what James Waugh looked like. All I can do is guess based on the little scraps of info that we do have.
yeah.
So, I guess my superpower would be to tell people from 200 years ago to write things down and put it in a strong box and keep it safe. Don't let anything happen, so that you can share your stories with your descendants who want to know who you were and what you did.
So what are you doing? What's in your strong box, or what are you putting together so that your descendants 200 years will have it a little easier when they go and they want to find out who exactly you were, what was your life like, and um,
Well, I'd like to spend the latter chapter of my life as a storyteller, essentially. And part of that is I feel a duty to my children. I have two girls and a stepson, and I want them to know who I was, what I cared about, why I did, where I came from, why my life was the way it was, and what was important to me, and I'm going to start writing that down, so that that can be shared moving forward. You know, writing an autobiography or a memoir is a self-indulgent activity, but I hope that someday, maybe hundreds of years from now, people will know that, you know, I play guitar and I collect hockey cards, you know. Uh, those are some of the things I love. And I think that that's important too. It's not just about, I was born in 1970 in Mississauga, Ontario, and, you know, and on all the other dates and information about me. I want to be able to share what's in here and what's in here. So that I feel compelled to write that down as well.
Well, thank you very much again for joining me today and discussing your wonderful finds you had about your ancestors. And I do really want to encourage other people to do the same thing. Start researching. Start digging into the stories of your families and trying to find out more about them, so you can make that history not just personal but meaningful to you, and it's have that understanding of how you got here and how all the things that shaped you. Like Darren mentioned, you know, those traditions that are family traditions. Where did they come from? Why do you do these type things? These are all wonderful reasons to get involved in researching your own family history. And I encourage you to keep searching for your ancestors, and you know, use those resources. Use AI. AI can be a wonderful resource to do things, to recreate, as Darren mentioned, an image of that doesn't exist. So it won't be exact, but you can. It helps you in your mind be able to picture a person or a situation. And whenever you put a picture to a name, it becomes more memorable. So thank you very much, Darren, and you have
My pleasure.
great day.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. Have a good one.
That brings us to the end of another episode of the How We Got Here podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Brian loves hearing from you, so please feel free to leave a comment below. If you have a burning genealogy question or a fantastic idea for a future episode, send an email to podcast@howwegothere.ca.
So that's the story, that's the ride. Thanks for coming right here by our side. We dug up